Milo owned two stocks. One was up 30%. One was down 30%. Milo sold the winner in about 4 minutes of thinking. Milo held the loser for 2 more years. Ask Milo why, and the answer sounds completely reasonable. It's not a loss until I actually sell it. That sentence feels true. It is, technically, mathematically, not true at all. But it's one of the most common sentences in investing. And it's costing the people who say it a measurable, well-documented amount of money every single year. Here's what's actually happening underneath that sentence. And it has a name and decades of research behind it. In 1979, psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky published research showing that losses and gains are not processed as mirror opposites in the human brain, even when they're the exact same size. Losing $100 feels roughly twice as bad as gaining $100 feels good. Not slightly worse, roughly double. This is called loss aversion, and it's one of the most replicated findings in behavioral economics, showing up in study after study, across cultures, across income levels, across completely different kinds of decisions. Their original research, part of what became known as prospect theory, changed how economists thought about decision-making generally, because it broke a basic assumption that had stood for decades that people evaluate outcomes based on their final overall wealth rationally, the same way regardless of whether a given change was a gain or a loss. Kahneman and Tversky showed people don't do that at all. They evaluate changes relative to a reference point, usually wherever they currently stand, and losses relative to that point hit with dramatically more psychological force than identically sized gains. Here's what that asymmetry does to an investor holding a losing stock. Selling the stock means converting an uncomfortable, uncertain, maybe it recovers feeling into a confirmed, permanent, unavoidable loss. And because losses hurt roughly twice as much as equivalent gains feel good, the brain will go to enormous lengths to avoid making that conversion, even when avoiding it is actively costing more money by the day. This specific pattern has its own name in finance research too. It's called the disposition effect, and it was documented in detail by the economist Terrance Odean in a 1998 study that looked at actual trading records from over 10,000 real brokerage accounts, not hypothetical scenarios. Odean found that investors were significantly more likely to sell stocks that had gone up than stocks that had gone down. They were, in his own words, disposed to sell winners and hold losers. What made Odean's study so convincing was that it wasn't asking people what they thought they'd do, or what they believed about their own habits. It was looking at what actual investors, with actual money, had already done, across thousands of real accounts and millions of real trades. Self-reported behavior is easy to flatter. A decade of brokerage records is much harder to argue with. And the pattern held up consistently across nearly all of them. And here's the part that makes this genuinely expensive, not just psychologically uncomfortable. Odean tracked what happened next. On average, the losing stocks investors were holding on to actually went on to underperform the winning stocks they'd already sold. Over the following year, investors weren't just making an emotionally understandable choice. They were, on average, making the mathematically worse choice. Systematically, in the exact same direction, for the exact same psychological reason. Over and over again, Milo's two stocks followed the pattern almost exactly. The winner got sold fast. The gain locked in. The good feeling collected immediately, while it was still available to collect. The loser stayed, quarter after quarter, because selling it would mean admitting, on paper, in a number, that the original decision to buy it had been wrong. As long as it stayed unsold, that number stayed theoretical, a story that hadn't ended yet, instead of a chapter that had already closed. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it reveals something uncomfortable about what not selling actually is. It feels like patience. It feels like conviction, like believing in the investment for the long haul. Sometimes it genuinely is exactly that. But very often, underneath the story of patience, the actual mechanism is loss aversion doing what loss aversion always does, protecting you from the sharp, immediate pain of a confirmed loss, at the cost of a much larger, slower, less noticeable one. The two can look identical from the outside, which is exactly what makes this so hard to catch in the moment. Genuine conviction and loss-averse avoidance both produce the same visible action continuing to hold. The only way to actually tell them apart is to check what's driving the decision underneath. A real, current belief that the investment is still the best use of that money, or simply an aversion to making a number on a screen turn from theoretical into final. Here's a test worth running honestly. On any losing position you're currently holding onto for reasons that feel like patience. If you didn't already own the stock, and you had the exact same amount of cash sitting free right now, would you choose to buy this specific stock today, at today's price, based on what you actually know about it now? If the honest answer is yes, holding it is a real decision, made on the merits, and that's completely fine. If the honest answer is no, then the only thing keeping you in it is the fact that you already own it, which is not a reason. It's loss aversion wearing the costume of a reason. Milo ran that exact test eventually. 2 years and a considerable amount of additional decline later. The honest answer was no. Milo wouldn't have bought that specific stock, at that specific price. Starting fresh that day, selling it didn't feel good. Exactly. It felt like finally converting a 2-year-old slow-motion loss into a single, sharp, honest number which, it turns out, was actually less painful than the 2 years of quietly not looking at it had been. This isn't only about stocks, even though that's where it's easiest to measure precisely. The same asymmetry shows up in a subscription you keep because canceling feels like losing something, even when you barely use it anymore. It shows up in a house that isn't right anymore, kept partly because selling would mean admitting the move wasn't what you'd hoped. It shows up in negotiating a lower price and stopping short of asking, because the small, immediate risk of a no feels heavier than the larger, ongoing cost of never asking at all. Loss aversion doesn't check whether the thing you're protecting is actually still worth protecting. It just reacts to the shape of losing, automatically, every time, regardless of the math sitting quietly underneath it. Even the language people reach for gives it away. Nobody says I'm protecting my loss aversion. They say I'm just not ready to let it go yet. Or it'll come back eventually. Phrases that sound like patience and function underneath. Exactly like avoidance, because loss aversion is remarkably good at borrowing the vocabulary of virtue while doing something closer to hiding. Knowing the name of the bias doesn't make it disappear. Milo still felt the same flinch, the same reluctance, on the next losing position that came along. What changed wasn't the feeling. It was Milo's willingness to notice the feeling, name it accurately, and ask the one question that cuts straight through it. Would I buy this today? Knowing what I know now, the feeling still shows up. It just doesn't get the final vote anymore. There's a specific reason this test works better than simply trying to feel less loss-averse, which almost never succeeds on its own. It doesn't ask you to stop feeling the flinch. It asks you to treat the flinch as information about your emotions rather than information about the investment, and to let a completely separate question, a forward-looking one, with no memory of what you paid, actually make the decision. The flinch gets to exist. It just doesn't get to vote. If this changed how you think about something you're holding onto purely because letting go would make it official, subscribe, because we'll keep telling these stories the psychology first, the money second, the same way we always have. Same honest stories, same simple truth. See you in the next one.